When something is too familiar or easy, it's boring. When it's too hard and we're failing constantly, we become very self-conscious. And we want to be in that sweet spot where something's kind of just outside of our comfort zone. We know we can attain it, but it's uncomfortable.
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. Today, we're speaking with a behavioral scientist best known for applying the power of influence to transform the way businesses approach sales, consumer engagement, and creating memorable experiences. Want the secret to guaranteeing your members are left with a positive impression when they walk out of your facility? Do you know what the IKEA Effect is? Why is it important, and how can you use it to build community? Why is novelty important, and how can you use it to make your business more memorable? Well, our guest today has all the answers. Please welcome the founder of the Influencers Dinner and author of the 2 a.m. Principle, Mr. Jon Levy, to the Escape Your Limits podcast. I've been reading a lot about you, Jon, and I think you'd be, I recommend people check out a lot of this stuff online, but I think you'd be an awesome person to kind of, meet somewhere and go out on a crazy night, because I'm sure you would just end up in one of the most amazing places. It reminds me of when I was in my sort of 20s, when I hear some of your stories, and it's exactly what we used to do. Probably not quite as sophisticated, but just as interesting, nevertheless.
It's interesting. I spent many years trying to figure out what causes people to have fun, exciting experiences, which meant that many of my evenings were absolutely miserable and terrible. And then there were a collection that were so epic and crazy that they were worthy of writing my first book, which is the 2 a.m. Principle. But yeah, I've done things like, at one point I dropped myself off in the city of Nice, where I didn't know anybody, didn't have a place to sleep. It was probably like, 8 o'clock at night or so. And either I would convince a stranger to put me up for the night, or I would sleep on the street. And I did that a few times around the world. And to this day, I've never slept on the street. But I'm not saying I was comfortable at any point. So,
no, very, very similar things. Like we used to just kind of travel somewhere and not have any plans, but somehow figure out we'd either stay up all night or we'd get back the next day. So so anyway, well, look, what I thought I'd start, Jon, is you've got many interesting areas, and I kind of focused on three. Most of our community is sort of within the fitness space, and I thought one of the interesting places to start, particularly with what's kind of going on in the world at the moment, is to kind of, I guess, unpack the sort of the experience. What is an experience? What are some of the elements that makes one, and I'll try and sort of, or an adventure, I guess, experience like adventure, and then I'll try and sort of relate that to some of the sort of questions that a lot of the people that we work with. So maybe just to give us a start, what is in you're, I guess, a behavioral scientist, and I know you've done a lot of work on adventures and experiences. So what makes a great adventure stroke experience?
So I think that that adventures and experiences are kind of a little different. And here I'll create a fun little differentiator. An adventure is an experience that is exciting and remarkable, meaning it's worth talking about. But it also possesses adversity and or risk, meaning you can't have an adventure unless there's something at stake. Now, that could be something emotional, physical, it could be monetary, but something that fundamentally forces you out of your comfort zone. And then the third characteristic of an adventure is that it brings about growth. The person you are at the end is distinct from the person who started. And so if you look at any great movie, any great story, the characters are fundamentally changed by the adventure that they're on. Now, I would differentiate that a little from having a great experience, right? You could take your kids out for a sporting event, and the experience is great, and you might go on an emotional journey throughout it, but it might not be an adventure for you. It might be an adventure for them. And that's kind of a difference, right? So I spend a lot of my career and a lot of my time looking at research on what makes life remarkable, what makes life better. And it kind of boils down to a handful of characteristics.
Right. So from a business perspective, then, with again thinking of a fitness experience, how could you create a kind of an adventure within that, or how could you sort of potentially create a fun experience? I know some of the things that you talk about is in terms of adventures is having something where there's an outcome, there's a journey, there's some novelty. So if you were to sort of I suppose apply some of those principles and that science which goes with that into a physical experience, what are some of the key things that are important for people to consider when trying to create one?
So here's I think something really important. For starters, actually, let's take an example of something I'm going through right now. A few years back, I was in Antarctica, and I went and I swam for 2.5 minutes in 0-degree water. Now, that was brutal. I had no training. But this year, while I've been stuck at home, I decided, I'm going to hire a level 3 Wim Hof instructor. Do you know Wim? The Iceman?
Yeah.
And so this is really pushing me to my physical limits, right? I have to train. I'm practicing and exercising with a breathing mask that limits the amount of air that can come in, right? It's got an entire training regimen to it. And what makes an adventure, one of the elements that makes an experience an adventure, is that there's some greater purpose or goal. And similarly, when you're on a fitness journey, whether that's going to run a marathon or coming in first in an Ironman or taking some weightlifting competition prize home, that goal that's out there that makes you uncomfortable, that forces you to redefine who you are in the process, is what allows for it to be an adventure. Now, sometimes people are so exceptional that they actually have to invent new constraints to actually make it interesting or a challenge. So you may have experienced this with your own fitness journey and your fitness experience, that it's, at a certain point, running 10K might be just uninteresting. And so in order to make it more interesting, the question is, what additional constraints can you add to the experience? Can it be that you're required to do it with a weighted vest? Could it be that you have to do it with a respiratory mask, so it becomes harder and you have to exercise your diaphragm more and learn to breathe more intentionally? And these additional constraints actually push you to that point that you're outside of your comfort zone. So it becomes a more adventurous and engaging experience. Because the fact of the matter is that human beings need this very particular space. When something is too familiar or easy, it's boring. When it's too hard and we're failing constantly, we become very self-conscious. And we want to be in that sweet spot where something's kind of just outside of our comfort zone. We know we can attain it, but it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was reading you mentioned about the constraints. I actually made a note here, and it's quite an interesting one, because I think when I was listening to you, you was explaining how important it is to have constraints within something. So I suppose when you think of an adventure, you think, okay, well, anything can happen. But I know there's a few examples that I heard you talking about where it's like, no, if you kind of narrow it down and try and make it fairly specific, you've got to be fairly creative around how you actually achieve that. I guess my question to you, though, with that is, how do you, if you're trying to create something for somebody else, how do you get that balance? Because I guess some people are very adventurous and they like a lot of uncertainty, and then some people, even a touch of change kind of makes them quiver. How would you go about kind of thinking that through?
So I think that there's 2 or 3 different things we can consider. The first is to look at it less on the activity and more at the people that you're with. So I'll give you an example. Like in my new book, which is called You're Invited, which is coming out in a month or 2, I kind of unravel this idea that everybody says networking is important, right? So if you have a business, you have to go network, make the right contacts. But if you actually look, people hate networking. It's a miserable experience. It makes us literally feel dirty and that we have to wash. Now, what doesn't produce that experience is making friends. And so whenever I looked at it, regardless if it's an adventure or an event or whatever it is, I look at how do we curate the right people in the environment. Because the wrong people can make the best event terrible. And the right people can make a terrible experience amazing. And so before we even begin on like, okay, what are we going to do? We might want to ask the question, who do we want to do it with? Because sometimes it's just not appropriate to bring people along for certain activities. Now, don't get me wrong. I've been in situations where I have a friend who had a terrible breakup and I'm like, I need to get their head out of this funk. And so I'll take them hiking or something like that to get them literally away from everything and pushing themselves and get the endorphins running, right? Absolutely, I get that. But if you're, let's say, running a business, you probably want a business partner or somebody to go on this adventure with that is probably has a whole collection of skill sets that you don't. You see, people think that diversity is a good thing. But the problem with diversity is that it makes things harder, right? If we agree on everything, Matthew, life is easy. We'll get a lot wrong. There'll be no dissent. We'll never see our own errors. Diversity comes from having clashing ideas and people's perspectives, but it also allows for ideas to improve and get better. That tension is really important. So I'm not saying that when you curate the people around you, they need to agree, but rather that they bring different skill sets and perspectives and connections. So that way it opens up a world of opportunities and options. I used to love to go out with groups where the people didn't know any of my friends. And the reason is that meant they had a whole other option and collection of friends. So if we were out on a Saturday night, then maybe they knew about a party, but it wasn't going to be the same one I knew about. So that's when diversity really helps, right? And the key is diversity of contacts, of thinking, of relationships, of all these things. And so the first thing I focus on is the people. Right. It's always the people.
And applying that to a business situation where you've got, I guess, clients, customers coming into you, would you do that by trying to sort of define the type of person that you're going after, the type of person you would like to attract into your business or whatever? Is that how you would do it? Because I guess it's difficult to really know the type of people that you want to attract to a business if you're, let's say, a fitness studio or something, because it could be anyone. So would you do that through some of your marketing communication work?
So here let's actually look at it. Can I bring up like a kind of fun idea from a different, this is from my new book, not my last book. There's this kind of wild idea called the prize law. And it works like this. It comes from this idea that if you look in scientific research and there's 25 people who wrote papers, you take the square root, 5 people did about half of the work. And it turns out that this kind of rule is probably true for almost every industry. So if there's 100 people in fitness, let's say, 10 of them are probably doing half of the deals. And so what I would do is I would first say, okay, how big is this industry? And then who are the people that are actually doing most of the work? So I can learn from them. I could mimic them. I can understand. I can have relationships with them so I could have deal flow. So I have the opportunities to really excel. And those are the first people I want to really develop relationships with. Now, it might take time to develop relationships with them. Remember, I'm vehemently opposed to networking. What I really want you to do is go and make deep and meaningful bonds with these people, become friends. And that'll take a bit of time. There are kind of like ways to hack it and accelerate the process. But I think that the first thing is, let's figure out how many people you're trying to connect with. And also, this is really important. You could be a wildly successful business person and be incredibly introverted, and that's absolutely fine. You might not like meeting 20, 30, 40 people at a time. What might be right for you is meeting one or two. And that's totally cool. Nobody says you have to live up to some kind of crazy image of what a successful person is like.
But essentially, what you need to do is to put in the work to kind of understand the type of person that you're going after and find more of those kind of people. Is that?
So I think that it's the people. Let me take it back a step. I think what we're trying to say is who's going to have the most influence over your success.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is going to be, yes, absolutely dedicated customers. But if we're going to go with focusing on customers, why don't we focus on evangelical customers, the kind that can't stop talking about your service or product and have to tell all of their friends about it? How do we find those people? How do we develop deep and meaningful relationships with them and make it as easy as possible for them to promote you? If we're going to talk about people in the industry, well, my hunch is there's probably like a handful of people who are putting the capital into these businesses. So those are the people that who'd have the most influence on maybe getting you financing to have your company grow. So there's, in anything that you're looking to do, there are people who have the greater potential to influence the outcome. Now, I'm not talking about like an Instagrammer that's posting. I'm talking different types of influence. There are people who just cover fitness media, right? And write stories. Knowing those people means that you'll get coverage. You could be seen as a thought leader. Knowing the financiers means that you could get investment capital. Knowing evangelical athletes means that people will be promoting your programs. So the key is, let's get really clear on who you want to connect with and then figure out the best strategy for developing real relationships with them.
Right. Okay, makes sense. So coming back to this experience, and one of the other things you mentioned, which I thought was quite interesting and relevant for fitness, is this. You mentioned how to learn. I think you called it something like, I don't know whether I'm confusing these two, but one of them was about learning, and the other one I've got here was, you called it the IKEA effect. So, which yes. I guess you're kind of learning and investing time. Maybe they're two separate things together. But again, thinking about a traditional business, what are some of the relevant, I guess, research that you've seen in terms of when you're creating something for a business, how you want to kind of take people on a journey where they're actually, they're more knowledgeable than what they were when they started, and they've also got, I'll call it having skin in the game.
Oh, for sure. So there's kind of like these two different ideas that I think we'll cover. The first is a super fun and absolutely ridiculous characteristic of human beings called the IKEA effect. Now, the way it works is, you may have noticed that if somebody gives you a gift, you may or may not appreciate it. Winning people over with gifts, not necessarily the best strategy. It turns out, though, that the opposite actually works, which is, if I can get you to do something for me, you'll actually care more about me. Now, that might sound weird, but think about it like this. People who assemble their IKEA furniture actually value that furniture more. It's the same reason that you care about your children, because you had to invest the effort into raising them and caring for them and staying up late with them when they weren't feeling well and so on. And so my objective when I meet people isn't to win them over, but rather for us to do something together and invest effort together. Then we'll care more about each other. And this is one of the reasons I love the fitness industry, because working out with somebody has an incredible value of that IKEA effect. In fact, research has shown that if both of us do, let's say, a plank together, and we're going through it and it's tough and we're struggling, even if we don't talk to each other, we'll like each other more afterwards because we had that shared experience. So one of the things I recommend is work out with people. That will really bond you, especially if you can be supportive or like have a healthy competition. Otherwise, the issue is that some people are really self-conscious when they work out, and if we ever make them feel bad or something like that, then they won't want to engage anymore.
So if you're inviting people into your business, and obviously you want to kind of encourage people to work out in groups or together to achieve that.
Yeah.
one of the other thing I thought was interesting is you tell a story about elevating people's heart rate, where there's a girl at the end of a bridge or something, and
Yes.
which I thought was very relevant to fitness, because I guess when you're going on a bike or a treadmill, and at the end of a class, you've already got that elevated heart rate. Now, maybe that's why these fitness instructors, people sort of, fall in love with them, because that psychology is going on. But again, what's that story, and how can that be used in a useful way within a business, or if all? I just thought it was quite a powerful story. And
so I actually love this idea, and I'm so happy you brought this up. There's two different ideas there. One is something called the peak end rule. And the fun example of it is, if let's say you're on a date and it's the best date you've ever been on, it's 3 hours in and you're at that point where you're going to lean in for the kiss. And just as you do, you look the person in the eyes and they say the most awful thing you have ever heard in your life. Now, if I asked you if that's a good date or bad date, what do you say?
Yeah, it's a bad date.
Yeah, it's a bad date. But notice it was 3 hours of perfection and 3 seconds of something terrible. Now, that's a little weird, right? If you average it out, you had an amazing time. And that's because human beings don't value the length of pleasure or pain. What they remember are the peaks of experiences, and especially how something ends. And so if something ends on a really positive note, we remember that disproportionately. So a few years back, I was asked by a company to throw an event. And I designed this experience with my team. People were invited to an event where they had to bring the names and addresses of 3 loved ones, and a world expert was flown in to teach them something. They entered, they grabbed some food, and then 12 at a time were pulled into a separate room covered in flowers. And the person at the front of the room is a top florist. And over the next 30 minutes, everybody learned how to make a perfect bouquet. And then once they were done, everybody explained who they were. And I think you know this private community of pretty successful people. So we had Nobel laureates, Olympians, and all these kind of executives from major companies and editors-in-chief. And the last person says, I'm the founder of a floral company, and we deliver beautiful bouquets anywhere in the city. And if you follow me, we have runners who are on the spot going to deliver your bouquets to your loved ones. So while people were still at the event, they got photos of their loved ones receiving their bouquets. Now, you can see 2 things in that. One is the IKEA effect. People cared more about the brand because they had to assemble the product. They learned about it. They indulged in it. They fell in love with it. And then the core values of the company, this delight of gifting something to somebody, was what happened in the last moments. They got that photo. And it triggered that emotional response. So what does this translate to for the business of health and fitness? First of all, what is it that can be accomplished in those last moments of a training class, an interaction, that will leave them feeling like it was an incredible experience, that leaves them with the core values of a company or your fitness program? What is your signature? And then clearly in a workout, they're putting in effort, but are there ways we can get people to put in effort unique to the organization? Some places, there's a fitness program in New York called ConBody, where where it's taught by former prison convicts. The U.S. has this terrible prison system and so it's a way for the trainers to re-enter society and find work. And so at the end of it, what you can do is, since you've earned your status by working out with them, you take a photo where it looks like you're standing for a mugshot, right? And then people post it. So now suddenly they're putting in effort and representing the brand. And in the end of the class, there's this whole thing that they do. And so essentially, suddenly you're giving people a pathway to become evangelical and put effort into the brand. And so those are 2 of them. There was a third thing that you actually brought up, which is called the misattribution of arousal. Do you want me to go into this?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. So this one comes from like a pretty funny scenario. Researchers had men cross a bridge, but there were 2 groups. One group crossed a standard bridge, right? Like Cars can pass on it and people and all that. It's perfectly safe. It's really solid. The second group crossed a high ropes bridge. So their hearts were pounding. They were excited. They had elevated levels of probably dopamine and adrenaline and all these neurotransmitters. And when they got to the far side, both groups were met by an attractive, or it was individual people, but all the people were met by an attractive woman who said, if you have any questions or need anything, please feel free to reach out. Now, the men who crossed the high ropes bridge, who had higher heart rates, who had higher levels of excitement, called her up and asked her out more frequently. Now, this is what's known as the misattribution of arousal. It doesn't mean like sexual arousal. What it means is that when you are having a positive aroused state, it's easy to confuse it for the person or the environment. So we've all had this experience where we go to a restaurant and we just have the most amazing night. And then we keep thinking that if we go back, it'll be just as great, but it isn't. And that's the misattribution of arousal. So here's the important takeaway though. Let's say you're going out on a date and you plan an incredible date, then the person is more likely to associate you with the experience of the date and then like you more. Similarly, if we can get people feeling a certain way in our classes, in our programs, they will attribute that emotional state with the program. Now, or with you. And here's what's interesting. It's probably a lot more valid for them to be associating that with your training program than with a person they go on a date with, because the training program is actually the thing that's causing it.
That's interesting. It also brings up, like, I was at a very nice hotel at the weekend for Easter, and when you arrive, you know, the suitcases come out of your car, and the guy comes there and brings it all in, and then when you leave, which is strange for hotels, but you have a great experience coming in, which I get is important. But when you leave, you seem to have more luggage than you came in with, and you're sort of left there to get it out to your car. There's no one there with a trolley or anything like that. So it's an interesting thing. I'm sure, you know, that those first impressions obviously are important, my guess. But from what you're saying, it's also those lasting impressions, and you know, making sure that you're putting the energy into those so that they will come back and return.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how, you know, the phrase is, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, right? And there's something to that you want to make sure that people's experience to the end is really special. And, you know, I design a lot of experiences. The one that I'm probably most famous for is 10 years ago, I created a secret dining experience. 12 people are invited. They're not allowed to talk about what they do or even give their last name. They cook dinner together. And when they sit down to eat, they get to guess what everybody else does. They find out that it's Nobel laureates, Olympic medalists, celebrities, famous musician, Oscar winners. I've hosted about 2,000 people at 227 dinners. I was doing about like 5 or 6 of them a month until COVID hit. And one of the things that we constantly had to look at is, I don't want just the experience to suddenly devolve into nothing so that people have a negative memory or just walk out tired. We wanted to end things on a really positive note so that the entire evening is remembered in that way. Now, that was really easy with the floral experience. We sent them photos of the people receiving the flowers. But it became much harder with our dinner events. And so what we ended up doing was creating a tradition where we teach people to saber a bottle of champagne. So we literally had this old French sword, a bayonet from 1778. And we say, okay, at this time, we're going to congregate everybody. We're going to saber this bottle of champagne, and this will be our last drink together. And so it creates this moment, and we toast and we drink, and then people go off their separate ways.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think there's some great ideas there in all types of business. You mentioned that you were doing these regular events up until COVID, and obviously it's changed. And reading some of your other materials where you're talking about this, I guess, people feeling, whether it's in business or events or whatever, that the in order to influence somebody, you need to be there face to face with them, whether it's in a sales situation or developing relationships. But then you also talk, which I thought was really interesting, and it kind of really hit me, and I'm still trying to sort of process it. But you also spoke about, or gave some examples of, number one, influencers that you never, unless you happen to go to an event to meet them, there's these people that are extremely influential that you would never have met. And yet you're seeing them for a few seconds on Instagram over and over again. And these people are very important in getting you to decide to go on vacation or invest in something. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's sort of stacked on top of that idea for me is you talk about dating sites. Well, I didn't, when that wasn't around when I was going out, I don't know, unfortunately or unfortunately, but people are now sort of making, decisions about people that they're going to spend the rest of their life with by almost this virtual situation. So I wanted to find out from you, because we haven't been traveling, and there was this great sort of article I wrote where you talked about, traveling somewhere on a flight for 6 hours and booking a hotel and all these things that are around it to have a 1 hour meeting and then to come back. But you kind of feel that was what's needed to get it over the line kind of thing. So tell me your views on sort of, this virtual world that we're living in. And are we still bringing with us this feeling that, look, there's certain things that you can only do face to face, or is that just kind of a limited belief system? And actually, no, you can do what you did if you use sort of virtual or digital in the right way.
So I will say this. Every time a scientist kind of says things are not likely or impossible, somebody figures out a way to do it, right? Like, it's just a matter of time. But where technology is now versus what we're actually capable of doing, I've never found a replacement for in-person experiences. There's fundamentally certain things, like, first of all, if human beings never came together again, there wouldn't be more human beings, but we'll get to that. That's not exactly the topic of this. So there are certain things that only happen in person, but also human beings have an incredible ability to apply meaning and value to just about anything. You look at a way a child relates to their toys, even though they're inanimate, to them, they're as real as I am. And they could have imaginary personalities. So if that's the case, there's a lot that can be accomplished virtually or theoretically, right? And I think the key is in understanding when and what. So let's take a look at in person just for a second. As I've gotten to see only a handful of people over the past year, when I give somebody a hug, they go, "Oh my God, this is so good." Like, just being able to physically hold another person. And I'm pretty sure that as a species that only survived because of our ability to connect, right? We're not the fastest, we're not the strongest species out there. We took over this planet because we can work together. And we fundamentally need each other. And so, although we can accomplish a lot, like we're having fun here, having a conversation, it's just not the same as being around each other and in person. So I'm personally somebody who cares a lot about spending quality time physically in the same space as other people. But since I didn't want to get people sick or congregate people during the COVID outbreak, we had to reinvent the way that we engaged. And the problem is that what most people do is they take their in-person events and put them online. And let's be honest, that's just not interesting. Like, people think we tune into stuff to be entertained and enlightened. And if I wanted to be entertained or enlightened, I would watch Netflix to be entertained, and I'd watch a TED Talk to be enlightened. I would not tune into some strange Zoom meeting or WebEx meeting. But then there's also these other two things that are absolutely essential. The reason I would go to a concert is not just for music. It's because I want to be around other people, even if I don't know them. There's something about the energy in a crowd. And the fact that I have an impact on the environment around me, that I have a sense of influence, right? If I clap and cheer, people hear me. If I boo, people notice that. when human beings don't have any impact on their environment, and they have this helplessness, they get depressed. And so if you want to effectively engage with people through digital platforms, we fundamentally need to give them a sense of influence, and we also have to give them a potential for connection. Now, at the base level, that's maybe using poll features. But what I've generally been doing with the community that I built is that I'll host about 150 to 200 of them at a time. And within a few minutes of them arriving on a Zoom platform, I'll send them into breakout rooms to play games together. And why games? Because if they're competing against other breakout rooms, then that's that bonding IKEA effect that we talked about. That's that ability to bond. So that way we're not networking, we're meeting new friends instead. And so that's the kind of reinvention that we need to have. The beauty of digital is that it allows us to give people at scale the feeling of being individually cared for. Right? I can have what feels like a really intimate conversation with you right now. But I could have the potential of doing that at scale. But to do that, we need to add interactivity or influence, and we need to add the potential to connect with other people, because fundamentally, that's what makes life exceptional, and the research keeps backing it.
So do you think with if you look at something like YouTube, for example, you know, I don't really watch television at all anymore. I haven't done for a few years, but I started to watch YouTube. One of the things that's sort of interesting about YouTube is it's like you've got your regular TV, as you know, and then there's the comments. And I suppose if it's a live YouTube, you then got that live interaction with people. You know, some of it's not great conversation, but there's still interaction and it's entertaining.
Yes, there's some weird people on there. That is for sure.
So is that, you know, do you think why some of these digital platforms like a YouTube or, you know, Facebook Lives and that are successful is because you're not just like your Netflix, which is, you know, they're spending millions on some of these 1 hour sort of movies and stuff. But unless you're at that level, then it's like, well, how do you have your content but create that sort of personal interaction? Is that what we're sort of seeing happening with some of these social media platforms now then?
So I think that what we're seeing is two things. One is great storytelling, regardless of the format, is all engrossing, right? So there's this kind of crazy characteristic called neuroentrainment, which is that if the two of us, Matthew, are hearing the same story, our brainwaves match up. That's pretty awesome. That means that for the most part, the same thing is going on in my brain as your brain. And that really doesn't happen for people. But with stories, it does. And I think that's where Netflix kind of fits in, is the potential of getting lost in a story. And as a species, we have shared our knowledge for generations through an oral history, right? If something is remarkable, worth remarking or talking about, it is culturally significant. And that's how we ended up with all the mythology that we have today, is it was passed through stories from person to person. Now, that's one side of things. But if you look at the evolution of storytelling, which is now the gaming industry is bigger than all other entertainment together. I mean, Hollywood and sports and so on, you combine them all, and music. Video gaming is still bigger. And the reason I would argue is probably three things. One is, it is a storyline that I can be a part of. I can be the main character. But the other aspect comes back to that sense of influence. So you know this from having a career running a company. You could be working for hours and have no idea if you're doing a good job. You could have no idea if you're contacting the right customers. You could have no idea if what you're saying to them works. But with a game has clear metrics and outcomes. And games are generally designed so that you're doing something just outside of your skill set. So it's fully engrossing and engaging. And so when we look at that kind of entertainment, it's once again entertainment that you could get fully lost in. The same way a great story kind of hijacks your brainwaves. And so I think what it comes down to is that there's kind of like these base mechanics that drive our behavior. Part of it is that we're wired for stories. Part of it is that we're wired for interactivity. And when it's the right level of difficulty, we get lost in it as well.
I guess coming back to your earlier point, in terms of the experience or the adventure, some of those things, I suppose, are within a good game. You know where you're going, but you've got your sort of constraints, and you've got that sort of unknown, surprise, novelty, etc. So I suppose modeling your business on a great game seems to tick a lot of the boxes that you recommend.
Here's another kind of weird thing, if I can. So I'm assuming you've done pretty well for yourself. And here's what's really amusing, is that being successful to the point where you have enough that you're not worried about making your rent or your mortgage payment or where your next meals are coming from, making more than that doesn't really impact your life. Like you get mildly happier retrospectively. And what I mean by that is that when I think about how successful I've become, I get happy knowing that I'm that type of person. I'm proud of myself. But moment by moment, you're not really any happier because you have 10 million in the bank than you have when you have $1 million in the bank. But what seems to make the difference is having work that really engages you, the kind of work you can get lost in, that you really enjoy, which means, and it's so cliche, like, they say it's not the journey, it's not the destination, it's the journey. It's really true, because let's say you achieve the greatest thing that humanity can achieve, right? The classic example is you were Buzz Aldrin and Lance Armstrong, and you were the first people on the moon, right? When they came back, after they had ticker tape parades and awards and TV shows and everything, I think Buzz became an alcoholic and, not Lance Armstrong, sorry, Neil Armstrong. Wow, that's super embarrassing. Lance Armstrong was the cyclist that doped the Tour de France, and Neil Armstrong was the man who stepped on the moon. So I believe he suffered from depression. And it's not surprising, because when you go out there and there's no mountains left for you to climb, right? There's no challenges left, then life can feel really purposeless. And so I think the key is, once you have something that you've developed kind of an expertise in and you can support yourself, to focus on making it engaging, right? You don't need to burn yourself out. It won't make you any happier having 10 million over that million. It might make you feel superior to your friends if you have more money, but that's that you got to deal with as what you're motivated by. But as long as you've got something that really engages you, that's just outside of your skill set, that can force you to grow, that's when life's interesting. That's when you have that adventure. That's when you get real satisfaction. It's in the playing of the game, not in the accolades along the way.
Some very deep message there, but very, very relevant. A couple of questions. I know we're relatively short of time, but I'd like to cover this one. I think it's very relevant to our audience. You talked about the obesity. I'm not sure whether it was a pandemic. Probably is.
Epidemic.
Epidemic. Yeah. And I thought there was some really interesting stuff as it relates to networking, but also communities. There's obviously, and so I wonder if you could kind of share that story and talk about the relevance of it as it relates to the influence within communities.
Oh, for sure. So this is one of my favorite studies. I think it was about the 2000s. These two researchers, Christakis and Fowler, were curious, does the obesity epidemic spread from person to person like a disease like coronavirus? Or is it a percentage of the population like, I don't know, Alzheimer's, right? You don't get Alzheimer's because somebody with Alzheimer's sneezes near you. And what they found was startling, that if you have a friend who's obese, your probability of obesity increases by 45%. Your friends who don't know them have a 20% increased chance, and their friends have a 5% increased chance. Now, this is also true for happiness, marriage and divorce rates, smoking habits, voting habits, probably in different percentages, but the principle is still there. And that raises an interesting question. Most of the time, we try to change our lives by saying, okay, I'm going to focus, I'm going to have really good willpower, and I'm not going to eat candy bars. But maybe what we really need is instead to surround ourselves with a few fitness professionals. Or maybe if we want to get our finances under control, we should make more friends who are really successful in finances. And then their habits will be contagious the way that, a cold is. And this is what's really interesting, is that I dedicated my life to trying to understand how to surround myself with the people who could have the greatest impact or influence on the things I care about. And my objective wasn't just to meet them. My objective was for them to meet each other so that they could have a positive impact on one another. That way, if, let's say, you have a friend who's incredibly fit, and you introduce him to 2 or 3 other people that you're friends with, there's a higher chance that all those people will be more fit. And now all of a sudden, everybody's going for a bike ride on a Saturday rather than getting drunk. And that's the kind of stuff I love, is that we can redefine our life by going and making friends. And that's a hell of a lot more enjoyable than trying to set an alarm for 5 o'clock in the morning and beating myself up for pressing snooze. And so here's what's kind of crazy. In my new book, You're Invited, I actually did all this research to understand the impact of community. And everybody exercises because they know that it has a positive health impact, right? But if you actually look at the predictors of longevity, on the low end, yeah, it's things like clean air and things like that. But exercise and getting your annual flu shot are on par with each other. Quitting drinking is the next thing. Quitting smoking is really important. But the top 2, if you want to live a long time, is having close social ties. And number 1 is social integration. You're part of a community. People know each other. Now, you want to talk about business success? You look at the great predictors of business success. You can look at company stock value, employee sick days, and profitability. And what you can see is that the level of oxytocin in people's blood is a predictive characteristic of all 3 of those things, which means that how much people feel belonging with the people they work with and their company is a great predictor of how successful the company will be. And so I'm all for fitness and exercise. I'm a bit of a fitness junkie, but what might be just as important, if not more, is invite a friend to work out with you. It'll make you better friends. And in the process, maybe it'll help you live longer and make your business more successful if you do it with coworkers. So I'm as you can imagine, very pro community and very pro bringing people together. And I couldn't encourage it more.
So there's a number of books. I'm going to put them in the notes. As I said, I'm conscious of time, but I recommend checking them out because there's a ton of stuff that we've just sort of skimmed over here, and I would suggest people sort of taking some time to look into it. It's fascinating in terms of influence and communities, and we haven't even talked about some of the cool parties that this gentleman arranges. But I'd recommend checking that out. I've got one final question. And I ask, we normally ask, well, I ask it for every guest, which is escape your limits is about escaping what you've believed is impossible and gone on to make it possible. And I ask people, what's a memorable example of escaping your own personal limits? Now, I know you've got loads, but I was listening to this story about Pamplona,
Oh
And
my God.
I just thought it was such a great story, a great lesson, really, and also it re-emphasizes your commitment to what you do as a
Mhm.
person. And I just wondered whether you'd mind sort of sharing that story with us.
I'll share a quick version of it. It was, I think, July 7th, 2013. I went to Pamplona for running of the bulls, and I made it through the run. And what I didn't realize is that when I ended up in the stadium, I would be so like high off of the excitement of having survived the run that it turned me into a complete idiot. And when bulls enter the stadium, they do it by running up kind of like a ramp, and people lie down, and then the bulls jump over them. So of course have this stupid idea that, okay, I'm going to lie down and let a bull jump over me. I'm completely essentially intoxicated on, dopamine and testosterone and all these things. And I lie down, and the bull's coming at us. I'm freaking out, and I'm crouched down on the sand, and the bull's about to make its jump, and it slips, misses its jump, and lands on my back. And I lose all feeling in my entire body. And time literally stops. Like the cheers and screams of the thousands of spectators in the stadium disappear. And I'm pretty sure I'm paralyzed. Like literally my entire body's numb. And as time has stopped, I start having this argument with myself. And I say, Jon, you idiot, you've completely destroyed your life. You might be in a wheelchair the rest of your life. And I then heard myself argue against that and said, if I end up in a wheelchair, I ended up in a wheelchair. But I would have never been happy living a normal life. And this is a fluke, and it could have happened in a million different ways. And I'll get through it. But I made the right choice to come here. I wouldn't have been happy in another way. And I managed to stand up, but my body is completely wrecked. It's obvious there's something really wrong with me. And I managed to make it. I'm yelling for a doctor and nobody's answering. And eventually some guy points to triage. And at this point, I'm feeling so much pain in my body that I realize I'm about to go unconscious. And just as I enter triage, a nurse sits me down, and I go out. And long story short, what ended up happening was that my left shoulder was crushed. I had a hoof print embedded into it. Because of the way I was lying on the ground, it tore my right shoulder because it couldn't move with the impact because I was pinned down so hard. And so it was years of physical therapy, and I had to be in wheelchair service at the airports. I couldn't even hold my bags because my muscles were so screwed up. But yeah, that's what happened in Pamplona. So the general takeaway is that the size of our life is in proportion to how uncomfortable you're willing to be. So I wish you an incredibly uncomfortable life and all the great things that come with it.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.